Hello and welcome back to the Virtual Classroom AP Euro Edition. I'm your host, Dr. Olmsted. As you can see, today's topic is the new monarchs with a little bit of economics thrown in as well. Before we begin, as always, take a moment, jot down that lecture outline, and pay particular attention to those key terms at the left. They'll be the key terms that you should be able to apply the who, what, where, when, why, connect them to each other, and to their larger historical significance. In other words, these are key terms that you will need to use on your essays and exams all year long. You got it? Let's get started. Now, we left off discussing the Italian and the Northern Renaissance. And while this is largely a, artistic, it is a philosophical, it is a cultural change, we did mention a few other things like, hey, Machiavelli and new politics. And we start seeing that a lot of these Renaissance, theorists and philosophers all begin to, say, maybe we need a new type of monarch as well, or at least a new type of leader. And again, we're not talking about democracy here, obviously, despite the fact that you're exploring ancient Greek. But we do see that we're going to see a new style of governing come about. It's going to spread throughout Europe. And you see even though the Renaissance is largely led by these noble families, it is going to see a transition in monarchical powers. So let's discuss here. I got a little slide for you here. Again, picture of these good old rich old white dudes who were, rulers and monarchs. But what is different here? Well, let's do a little comparison here. Medieval kings, their income comes from landlords, also known as vassals. So their income comes from estates or from vassals. These new monarchs are able to retain private income and directly tax the citizens. And so, again, it's a subtle change, but the very fact they have their own wealth, okay, and that they are able to tax versus just collect from vassals. It's a transition. Second, protection, okay. Well, in medieval times, basically the landowners, the noble, will provide private armies to support the king. You can really see very quickly that could be a problem, because what if the landowners don't like what the king's doing? They won't supply the army. So we see during this Renaissance period, the transition to new monarchs, they will create professional armies. So again, they have their own private state armies. If you remember Machiavelli, the state is above the people, right? And then you get to the advisors. And so with the medieval times, the king is relying upon the nobles for advice. In other words, he has a little council of elders, really the nobles, that are each dealing, again, theoretically with their own selfish ambitions, versus the new monarch system, wherein they create a centralized bureaucracy of middle-class officials. So what we're going to see here is, we're going to see some examples of this in a few minutes, but the idea that these new monarchs, they begin to recruit talent based on skill, not nobility. Now, this is good for two reasons. Number one is you're getting, skill. But number two is that these positions that are middle-class positions are being hired directly by the king himself. In other words, they owe their allegiance and their position to the king. And thus, their loyalty is to the king and the state, not to local landlords, local interests, or selfish, vain, nobility. And then finally, the idea of these new monarchs, they begin to create these top-down reforms in its relationship with the church. And theoretically, in the medieval times, the king owed his power to the church. Remember, they went and bowed down to the Pope, and thus the Pope has power over the king. But we start seeing a transition. This is a very summation of this, so we're going to have some examples of this in a few minutes. But the idea that the church begins to lose its power even more. They're no longer going to be subordinate to the Pope. So, the Renaissance period. The Renaissance period in 1460 marks the further expansion of a centralized royal authority. They're able to consolidate power and create the foundation for Europe's first modern nation states in places like France, Spain, and England. Now remember, we already talked about this transition, right? A little bit back in our late Middle Age lecture. Because we're talking about how the church is beginning to lose power, that the King of France was taking control over them, over the papacy. And thus, we start seeing this evolution continue during the Renaissance period, employing some of those ideas of nation state, the state's more important than the people that we saw with Machiavelli. And so these new monarchs on the continent began to make use of Roman law and declare themselves sovereign. Now, in doing so, they're also trying to incorporate the will and welfare of their people so that the people are reliant and owe their safety, health, welfare to the monarch, not to local nobles. In other words, these new monarchs begin to lay the foundation for centralized modern state. So this begins that transition to what we now know as a centralized bureaucracy or centralized state. And so how they do so? Well, the monarchs themselves, the governments, can establish a monopoly on tax collection, on military force, on the dispensing of justice, and for claiming the right to determine the religion of their subjects. Notice these are now powers that are being taken by these new monarchs. Now, are they absolute monarchs? No. And we're going to discuss that. New monarchs never achieve absolute power. And we'll have a whole lecture on absolutism, don't worry. Absolutism will not emerge effectively until the 17th century, i.e., King Louis XIV in France. So this is not going to be absolute power. They're still going to share it, but this is the transition to that. These new monarchs mark that transition from the old way of the medieval period to the new way, which we'll get to in the 17th century, of the absolute monarch idea. And so these new monarchs are not nation states in the modern sense, because you gotta realize part of a nation state involves nationalism, that the people who live there need to feel they belong to a nation. And quite honestly, during the Renaissance period, people's identity is still rooted to a more local or regional level. Again, see Italy. Again, this modern notion of nationalism does not emerge until the late 18th, early 19th centuries. So again, that takes a while. But this is that transition period during the Renaissance period. And so, what are some characteristics here? Well, one of the characteristics are they will reduce the power of the nobilities through taxation, through confiscation of lands, so from uncooperative nobles, in other words, and the hiring of mercenary armies in order to create or creation of freestanding armies. In other words, have their own armies. When you have to rely on the nobles for an army, there's a problem. So three major ways that they're able to increase their power. Number one, they reduce the power of the nobility through taxation. So they tax the nobles. Number two, confiscate lands from uncooperative nobles. And number three, hire mercenary armies or create a freestanding national army. Again, these are the three things they're able to do to weaken the power of the nobility. Again, to shift the tides or change the balance of power from the medieval period. And so we see a couple of things that help this out. The advent of gunpowder. Well, this helps increase the power of of royal armies, because too often the noble armies of the nobles are relying upon knights and, well, swords. And so that's one way. Number two way they're able to do so to help eliminate this thing is by granting titles to new peoples and allow these people to serve in the royal court as royal authorities. Again, this idea of placing middle-class skilled people, but by granting new titles, it's diminishing the power of those old noble titles. And of course, ultimately, we're going to decrease the power of the clergy. So, let me give you some examples of this. There we go. Let's start with France. I'll give you some examples of this. So, political and economic recovery had finally begun after the long 100 Years' War. right? Remember, the Hundred Years' War had left France depopulated. The farmland was torn up, was terrible. They were commercially ruined. And basically, it left a bunch of nobles fighting for absolute power. And so you're in a almost mini civil war or warring states period, if you will, if you know your world history. In France, you have decimated farmland, you're depopulated, your finances are ruined, and you have nobles vying for power. And what you need here is to get a new powerful monarch to kind of take control and create law and order, right? Enter Charles VII. And so he gets the Estates General, this is kind of the governing body of France at the time, to grant him what's called the taille, without any further need of approval from them. What's the taille? Land tax. So he's able to tax land, the taille, and the salt, which is a major export for France, the gabelle. This is important. So what happens is Charles VII is able to convince the Estates General to elect him and give him the excess power to collect land tax and salt tax. And in return, he moves to end the 100-Year War. Now, no, he does not end the 100-Year War. He moves to end it and to rid France of English invaders. So he's going to claim law and order. And in doing so, he's going to usurp more power, strengthen his royal finances by taxing the nobles on their land and the salt exports. So notice the trend here, right? We have a chaotic system. We have a powerful man come in and say, hey, I will solve your problems. Here's what you're going to do. You are going to give me finances. So I'm going to tax your land and salt, the gabelle and the taille. And this will give me strengthen my personal finances. In fact, taxes will become my number one source of revenue as a king and the government. And by the way, number one source of royal income for 300 years. And in return, I will create a permanent army that owes their allegiance to me, not you. And in return, by the way, I'm going to get rid of the English invaders and end the 100-Year War. Oh, and I'm going to also take over the church because I'm more powerful than the church is. Again, this is the rhetoric of a king or a royal or a dictator. Right? This is the idea. They want to achieve absolute power. Now, Charles VII is not able to fully do this. Now, he gets the ball rolling. He gets the votes to do it originally. He gets the tax money. He will create the Free Standing Army, and he will begin to end the 100 Years' War. The one who will do so, though, is Louis XI, aka the Spider King. Honestly, I have no idea why he's called the Spider King. Well, actually I do, but it's more fun for a story. See, Louis XI, he utilized an extensive system of spies, i.e. spider webs, who could communicate with him through a system of post horses, like the old Pony Express. They were able to carry messages to him very effectively, established in 1464. Now, on the one hand, this is able to spy on people. Yay! Oh, wait, sorry. I'm supposed to say that out loud. What this does do is allow him to send written instructions, which would not be able to be misinterpreted, and to receive written replies quickly. In other words, he's able to communicate across his vast country. Now, there's a downside, which is they're able to spy on, wiretap and create a system of spies, hence the term Spider King. But he's able to modernize communication, standardize communication, that he's the one in charge. You will not misinterpret him. There's not going to be passed like a game of telephone between 4 or 5 different people. The system's going to be set up to carry the mail, basically. Again, mail is important. He's able to provide security to his people because he will end the 100 Years' War by bribing the English army to go home in 1475. Yeah, he actually bribed the English army. Why not? It works. Then he also creates a very large royal army. He will deal ruthlessly with nobles. He will increase taxes, again, called the gabelle. He will exert more power over the clergy. So all those things that Charles VII started to do, he will follow through with them. And he will actively encourage greater economic growth, not just salt, but also in silk. Now, again, we talked about this last time during the Renaissance period. We see silk becoming a major industry in Italy, right? And then I mentioned that because they stole it from China. Well, this is now the silk production has now reached France, and this new industry is being promoted heavily by Louis the 11th, and he will encourage foreign craftsmen and foreign merchants to immigrate to France and make France great again. And he will enact commercial treaties with England, Portugal, and the Hanseatic League, we talked about before. So he enters into all these international trade agreements with his neighboring nations. He encourages new economic development with silk production. He's able to decrease the power of the nobles by taxing them even more ruthlessly and have a freestanding army. He ends the 100 Years' War, and he's able to control communication via this network of post horses, and also get dirt on nobles to use against them by using this network of spies. Phew! Oh, if that was not enough, what else did he do? He also would leave a legacy for the next ruler, which is Francois the First. Fun little fact, he's actually the first to be called Your Majesty. But he will replace Latin with French as the official administrative language of the government. Why? Because A, that's the vernacular, and B, it reduces the power of the church. Because no longer are you beholden then to Latin, which is the language of the Catholic Church. Now, he will require the Roman Catholic Church in every parish to record births, marriages, and deaths. Now, this is a common thing in history, right? That churches often were the ones administratively to record the births, the marriages, and the deaths. Because often, the priest is there at the birth, they're baptizing the kids, so you get the birth record. They're there at the marriage, obviously you get married at the church. And then, of course, the death, they're buried, or at least have the funeral procession started at the church, right? The last rites. And so because of that power the church already did, Francois decided to make this an official duty, which A, frees him up to do work on other things, his government. But it also is theoretically, again, putting the church underneath the king in a reversal of roles. And so we see this as a kind of a big sticking point here. And then in 1516, he issued the Concordat of Bologna, which authorizes the king to nominate bishops, abbots, and other Catholic officials. Notice, the King of France now has the power to appoint bishops to the French Catholic Church, the Galatian Church. This is a major blow to papal influence from Rome. But, so on the one hand, this is a diminishing of the church. That's true. But, this is also one of those reasons why the Reformation will not touch France much. So much like we talked about last lecture about how because the manneristic ideas of Spain, the mannerism ideas, they had begun to develop some modest reforms in the Catholic Church, that the Reformation doesn't touch them. Likewise, in France, because the king has taken kind of the control from Rome, that protest against the church, hence the term Protestant, the protest against the Pope doesn't really reach into France either, which is one of the reasons why both Spain and France remained firmly Catholic, even during the Reformation period. And so we see this also, he begins what's known as the Valois dynasty. And so while the Spider King really begins and cements his foundation, Francois I is known as the first of the Valois dynasty and the first to be called Your Majesty. So again, these few examples from this process, again, it's not one single ruler, it's this evolution, right? And so this is an evolution of the process in France. Well, and then there's also, of course, England, and of course, ultimately the House of Tudor, right? Now, how did this house start? Well, the 100 Years' War, once again, back to that. Likewise, in England has caused a tremendous loss of manpower and hurt the economy. Now, as we start ending the 100 Years' War, there will be a new war, the War of Roses, between 1455 and 1477. Basically, long story short of this, I'm going to give you the kind of abridged version of the War of Roses. Two noble families, the House of York, symbolized by a white rose in Richard III, and the House of Lancaster, red rose, Henry VII. So these are your two major parties here, right? You have your House of York, symbolized by the white rose, and the House of Lancaster, the red rose, who will fight a civil war between the two houses to gain control of the crown, and thus to try to establish a new dynasty. Now, ultimately, Henry Tudor will defeat the York King Richard III at Bosworth Field and establish what is now called the Tudor dynasty, who will rule England from, again, the 1470s through 1603. So you're talking almost 250 years of the Tudor family dynasty. All because, well, Henry Tudor will win this battle in Bosworth Field over Richard III, the House of Lancaster. Now, we have this new Henry VII, Henry Tudor, who will be known as Henry VII. He will seek to weaken the aristocracy. Now, he actually has an advantage over, say, the Spider King or Charles VII in France. Because of the war itself, the War of the Roses, many of the aristocracy and nobles were actually killed during the War of Roses. And because they're some of them are dead, it weakens their power. And number two, because they were a defeated foe in war, Henry VII will immediately abolish their right to maintain private armies. So he has a pretext for this, right? This is not just, hey, I'm going to raise a national army because I want to diminish your power. No, this is, you're a defeated foe who are fighting against me using your private armies. I'm going to abolish your private armies so you can't fight against me again. Yeah, it makes sense, right? Shoring up his power. And of course, the ultimate issue is this leads to him becoming a new monarch. So who is King Henry VII? Well, he will seek to reduce the power of the nobles. He will do so through these two bullet points on your screen, the livery and maintenance. Now, livery was this idea, okay, going back to medieval times, where livery was that you would be given, as a commoner or a foot soldier, you would be given a uniform or a badge to a follower to identify them as your man. Kind of like gang colors, basically. Everyone wore their own gang colors in medieval England. And this became a major issue because it signified that you were not united under the king, but rather to your local noble or your local lord or your local aristocrat. And so he eliminates this because it signals that you're divided. He's in one. He wants to create a more of an English identity. Again, it doesn't happen overnight. We don't have nationalism yet, but it does begin that process. The second thing he outlaws is maintenance. And basically this is done. So let me understand what this is. So in the Middle Ages, nobles would recruit men of lower status and force them to wear their livery, their symbol, their color. In return, these men were promoted to the lord's position wherever they were. This system was good because it allowed you to quickly raise an army if the needs arise, like the 100 Years' War. The king would issue order to his lords to supply men to fight, and the lords would call what were called the retainers, who were wearing their livery to serve. The problem: there's a chance that the noble or groups of nobles would have more retainers and be more powerful than the king. So you get it? And maintenance basically means that they're going to, the noble looks out for the commoner who wears their colors. The problem with this, of course, is nobles have these huge private armies all wearing their own insignias that they're looking out for. But that means they're loyal to the local regional ruler, the noble, not the king. So he outlaws these things. And to further diminish the power of the nobles, he enacts what's called the Star Chamber. The Star Chamber prosecuted crimes seen as too serious to be dealt with by ordinary courts. Now, it sounds good in theory, right? oh, this is a much too serious offense. We need to have a more powerful court to interpret this case. The problem is these ordinary courts the king had no control over these ordinary courts. And therefore, the Star Chamber was meant so he had more control over the court system. It was especially used to prosecute people who were politically or socially important. Because local courts, because they have such importance, they're celebrities, right? They're wealthy. Local courts would be too afraid to convict them based on their power and stature. But by the king overseeing this Star Chamber court, he is allowed then to oversee, and he's not afraid to upset the nobles. In other words, he's able to usurp control of the courts. And by doing it, he's able to limit the power of nobles. He's allowed under the Star Chamber system to extract confessions by torture. Yes, nobles were held without a trial, were tried without a jury, sorry. They could not confront witnesses, and they were often tortured. Again, this is like an inquisition, used against not the church people, but against the nobles. And instead, in order to facilitate this, King Henry VII issued what's called the Justice of the Peace. The Justice of the Peace were responsible for maintaining law and order throughout England by executing legislation passed back in London. In other words, they were acting as a local government officials whose power was over the local police or the local sheriffs. The difference. Why is this important? So let me repeat that. These Justice of the Peace were responsible for maintaining law and order throughout the kingdom, throughout England. They are executing legislation enacted by London, whose power supersedes local sheriffs in local jurisdictions. Here's the big difference, though. These Justices of the Peace owed their office to the king. They were appointed by the king himself, not local lords. And so what they did, they set this system up where there were approximately 18 counties they divided their nation into. And they were able to use the Justice of the Peace in order to, usurp royal control. Again, this is not absolute power yet, but he's able to begin this process of usurping his power, which means he's a new monarch. Now, also what Henry would do is actually issue what was called new titles. And so rather than allowing nobles to buy up other lands or take other lands, King Henry VII was actually able to create new titles, new lords that owed their allegiance to him because he gave them the title. And then he would distribute this land, and it does two functions. One is loyal lords who owe their title to him, and it limits the sizes of other noble land holdings. Again, this is very smart. The other thing, the issue in England that we were talking about a lot, and we're going to mention it here, then we're going to come back to this topic a lot. And England's very different because England had long had the Parliament. And even when we get to absolute monarchies, the Parliament is a sticking point for kings of England because theoretically they have to share power, and Parliament controls the purse. And so if England goes to war, the King of England must call Parliament back to session, because they're not always in session back then. He must call them back to session and ask for money to wage war. The problem with this, if you're King Henry, is that means you're sharing power. And so he would often resort to diplomacy. In other words, no matter what you do not go to war, because if you do, you have to call back Parliament to get money, because they hold the purse strings. And so he does everything he could in order to avoid this. And again, one of the reasons here is because of the purse string issue, is that theoretically, while he does standardize taxes, it is ultimately Parliament who gets the tax money. And thus, the Tudor dynasty will never have the full power over taxation like the Valois dynasty in France. Now, I'm going to mention one more king to you as an example of this new monarch, but we're not going to go into great detail yet. And of course, it's King Henry VIII. And this is, again, just brief. Note that, again, he's a new monarch. He's an example of a new monarch who's ultimately going to break away from the Catholic Church, again, usurping that clergy and church power. And of course, he will establish the Church of England that will have the King of England as its head. And he will oversee the expansion of royal bureaucracy and become the most powerful king in English history up to that point. But again, we'll talk about more of him in a future lecture on the Reformation issue. But for now, let's stop here. And when we come back, we will talk about Spain. How does Spain deal with this new monarch situation? But until then, take care and bye-bye.